job to pull together everybody that was involved in getting the series going when we first got it. One of the things about the series was the unique look that we were required to achieve and the technical problems that we had with that.
The biggest thing you'll see on screen that we did here at Mainframe was the cartoon look of the series. From the way the characters are shaded, which is how they're painted, the two-tone look, to the ink lines that are drawn around them to make them look like a comic book.
We were able to compress what was normally a three-dimensional world and give it a real flat 2D space.
Comic books are good for reference as a starting point. There's certain things that work well in a still frame that really don't work that well when the characters are moving. A lot of ink detail in the darker areas of the image doesn't translate well into motion.
In our first test of this, we had nothing but black contours, and with that, we found we were getting everything looking too muddy.
As you get farther back, it's going to be noisier.
At this stage here, we have contours that match the tone of the object that they're applied to.
So this example of Mary Jane, you can see that on her face versus her hair versus her lips versus her clothing, there are different colors for the contour lines. And one thing you have to be careful about in these situations is that where the two different models intersect, because of the different colors of the contours, it can flicker because it's not sure which color to use.
Especially getting more complicated organic shapes, things start swimming all over and you get very distracted.
We had about 3 months to develop the Spider-Man model and test him and make sure that everything with Spider-Man would work. When you have 5 lines of production of Spider-Man going at the same time, that character is distributed amongst about 50 plus animators. You'd better be working or else you've got 50 problems.
So one thing you might find you're doing more is rotating the shoulder bones more than you might normally for some characters. That's okay. Just an X.
Early in the game, we needed an animator to test our model Spider-Man, so I went straight to Clayton Ryan and said, "Clayton, what are you doing?" And Clayton said, "Nothing." And I said, "You want to work on Spider-Man?" Clayton just grabbed his things and left straight to the Avid and started to work on a number of shots.
I mean, early on we were experimenting with Spider-Man galloping up a wall like a horse or something like that on all fours just to make him go super fast, rounding corners on all fours, using his web line in new and innovative ways, like throwing it out from his wrist and just kind of spinning it like an actual spider would, building a web.
We had to develop a new kind of crawl for Spider-Man because we had to throw out the knee to the side or else he would have intersected with the building. I love this crawl. We wanted to push the model to an extreme pose and I love it.
Spider-Man got very compartmentalized as far as animation went because technically it was a very challenging series. Definitely more acrobatics and action than we've done as a company in the past.
One problem with CGI is the more elements you add to a scene, the heavier the scene gets for an animator to use. And one of the requirements that Sony had for us was to populate the city of New York. And if we couldn't populate the city, we wouldn't get the series. So we had to come up with an idea to create render-friendly, multiple-person sets.
These guys are basically the catch-all for when these don't hold up.
Yes.
Right. I mean, they're not. You
Exactly.
can't. But you can't populate a set with those guys.
No, that's the other thing. I don't want to. I don't want to have a set with 20 of these in.
One of our technical directors, Jason Osipa, basically took these generic people and ripped their skeleton straight out of their body and made them these walking shells, and we used them in the background.
We built quite a few lower resolution characters that we could use that would be as light as possible to throw in as many as possible into the streets of New York. We built traffic patterns for cabs, cars, and we saved off as much of this as possible continually throughout the series to try and make it easier for the next show that came into production to use the same resources, so we weren't continually reinventing the wheel, which sometimes happens more often than not.
Spider-Man, that was a slightly different nut to crack because of the requirements to make it look like more of a 2D flattened stylized image, so the lighting we had approached differently. We had different shaders, or the shader called Uber Shader, which we developed here to help bring out just a two-tone look. That's a lot different way of dealing with things than what we had done before.
We were testing multiple lighting scenarios, day and night, realizing that once we eliminated lights, we got a better look, and we ended up with usually 2 sets of lights instead of the normal requirements of 3 or more.
A typical show isn't quite as intensive as the Spider-Man show was. Pretty much everything you'd see on the screen was written in-house. We wrote everything to do with the look of the characters, how they're shaded, how the ink lines are drawn around them, the actual geometry of the characters themselves. The software to do that was developed in-house.
In the pre-production early phase, we dealt with software a lot to deal with more of the management of the shaders and how we can get these thrown onto all the different materials for all the different characters and how we can edit them quickly without going into each shader every time to open everyone up, which I had to do at the beginning, which is kind of crazy, going to 300 shaders and clicking a bunch of little switches for each one, things of that nature, trying to make things more efficient for just the whole production process.
But in this situation, because the sets and the characters were being reused so often, it was quite a challenge to create something that was actually reusable in many different scenarios and still have that the contrast between the character and the backgrounds.
Well, Spider-Man was basically an extremely difficult model to work with. Typically with television, we don't have to worry so much about how the muscles are properly moving because you can cheat it a little bit. Spider-Man, because they want actual geometry for muscle tone, we had to make sure that the muscles do deform properly to the bones. Every point that you see on each intersection, they have to be mathematically calculated in percentages as to which bone it'll rotate with, it'll deform with. And in dealing with the textures, we basically had to localize different geometry within the body. So we actually had to hand paint the webs on the geometry. And then in certain areas, I guess we'd have to create little highlights to emphasize the muscles.
Traditionally in mainframe, we've been working on shows that have that 3D look, and Spider-Man is our first full-scale production that's in 2D. And so some of the modeling methodology had to change. This would be pretty much the final look of some of our other previous productions. And with our shader on, the difference is night and day. This is Mary Jane here with our Ubermatte shader. And what it does is it creates a plateau of the diffuse so that you have 2 separate colors. And also we have the contour shader on. So it's definitely got the toon look.
One thing we also had to be very careful of on this show that we found out early on is we can't build characters the way we do for normal three-dimensional shows. Normally you want to build something with nice soft curves because that's the way people look. But in the case of this show, because the software that draws the ink lines is more sensitive to sharp angles than it is to gentle angles, we had to chisel a lot of the characters.
So what we had to do, for instance, with Mary Jane here, is to create the lines that Sony wanted for her nose. We had to give more acute angles for the nose, and in doing so, the contour will actually show up.
It's surprisingly difficult to tell a computer to draw something two-dimensional as opposed to three-dimensional.
What we do here is it's part of modeling, and we build shapes, and those shapes are used by animators. When I'm looking at Mary Jane here, this is before the voice. We take a look at the face and see what kind of characteristic or personality they would have. And for Mary Jane, we tried to create shapes that were attractive and cute, and so that even when she's angry, her face is still appealing. So what I do is I would grab the model that was built by the modeler, and we would set up the skeleton, neck bone, head bone, and inside we've got the eyes, the eye rig. We set up also, we fit each character with a set of teeth and a mouth bag, which is inside of the mouth. Since we're focusing on the grin head only, I remove the hair, the jewelry, the necklace and the earrings, and build the shapes, starting with the mouth. And then from the mouth, we work with the eyes and the eyebrow shapes. It pretty much includes everything that the face expresses.
For a second, seeing you behind the desk, you look just like some of those photos of your father.
They give us an animated file that shows MJ going through all of her various different building block positions. Some of these get used sometimes, some not all of them, but they're all kind of in the palette that the artist can use. What I'm doing is I take a snapshot of the model in each of these different key poses and find out what's happening within the model, where the jaw is moving to perhaps, where the eyes are looking, what shape the face is in. And what I use that information for is plugging that into our in-house software called Grin. That's what the animators are going to use to sync up their character's performance to the dialogue. This is a completely customizable interface that changes from show to show. The animators have given us a lot of feedback on what kind of controls they want in this, and we put it all together. And so the end of my job is when I've set up a character like this, and I hand that off to the animators to use.
Is there something I did that I should know about? Stole your seat on the subway? Okay, now you're definitely not getting an apology.